Hello everyone! In this video we're going to define the key terms from Period 1. These terms are commonly seen in the primary sources the College Board uses, as well as the questions and possible answers. I highly recommend taking notes during the video, as that will help with retention. Okay, let's get started. Around 6000 BC, Mesoamericans began cultivating maize into a nutritious crop. It had a higher yield per acre than wheat, barley, or rye, the staple cereals of Europe. The resulting agricultural surpluses encouraged population growth and laid the foundation for wealthy urban societies. Later, the Mississippi Valley and the southeastern woodlands of North America had cultures defined by the successful agriculture of maize. The Great Basin region is located between the Rocky and Sierra Nevada mountains and is characterized as a high desert climate. Native Americans who lived there relied on a mostly hunter-gatherer lifestyle with some dry cultivation of maize. In the Great Plains region, there was some agriculture along rivers. However, this land was dominated by hunter-gatherer societies. They were transformed by Europeans who brought horses and livestock. Tribes such as the Comanche, Sioux, and Crow adapted the horse to their culture and dominated their opponents who were on foot, allowing them to obtain vast amounts of territory through raids. Bison hunting, the main food and supply source, was also dramatically changed as hunters who previously relied on stealth became much more successful on horseback. Hunter-gatherers were individuals, groups, and tribes that relied on finding and hunting for their subsistence. They tended to be very mobile, and some moved with wild animal migrations. In pre-Columbus Native American tribes in the Great Plains and Great Basin tended to be hunter-gatherers, and some in the upper Midwest and Northeast were partially nomadic with aspects of settled agriculture and hunter-gathering. In the Northeast and along the Atlantic seaboard, some societies developed a mixed agricultural and hunter-gatherer economy that favored the development of permanent villages. In the Northeast and along the Atlantic seaboard, some societies developed a mixed agricultural and hunter-gatherer economy that favored the development of permanent villages. In the economies of the Spanish colonies, Native American labor was used in the encomienda system to support plantation-based agriculture and extract precious metals, especially silver. And Native American labor was gradually replaced by African slavery. Native Americans migrated across the North American continent. As time went on, the settlers had to adapt to change their societies to better fit the environment they were living in. In contrast to the hunter-gatherer Great Basin and Great Plains societies, those in the Northeast, Southeast, Atlantic seaboard formed agricultural-based economies. This type of economy favored permanent villages that consisted of stable housing due to the fact that the people needed to stay in one place so they could tend to their crops. The Western Hemisphere is the part of the world that makes up the Americas. Europeans deemed it the New World. Pre-Columbus estimates range from 30 to 75 million Native Americans. The Spanish and Portuguese colonized large swaths of it and exploited Native Americans for resources and cash crops. Moving on to Portuguese exploration, Prince Henry the Navigator helped fund advances in sailing, especially the caravel sail, that greatly aided in long-distance travel against unfavorable winds. He also funded expeditions to the west coast of Africa. Later, the Portuguese would make it around the Horn of Africa, opening up the possibility of lucrative silk and spice trade links with Asia. This would influence other European nations, especially Spain, to fund bold expeditions like Columbus' transatlantic voyages. Spanish exploration of the Americas started in 1492. The main reasons were to find a trade route to Asia, find gold and silver, convert peoples to Christianity, and increase the power and prestige of their nation. When the Spanish reached the Americas, they spread deadly epidemics, created a racially mixed population, and a caste system defined by the intermixture among Spanish settlers, Africans, and Native Americans. In West Africa, there had existed great empires like the Songhai and Mali, but by the time of European exploration, it was fragmented into many competing West African kingdoms and tribes. Some of them partnered with European nations to enslave other Africans. This was part of the triangle trade, in which African slave labor went to the New World and were forced to mine resources and produce cash crops. The profits from the cash crops and resources went to European investors, traders, and monarchs, and some of those profits went towards increasing the slave trade. In the encomienda system, the Spanish capitalized on pre-existing Native American systems of tribute. The crown gave Spanish conquistadors large swaths of land to claim tribute in labor and goods from Native American communities. Also, Spanish officials co-opted the Inca Mita system, which made native laborers available for forced work in the silver mines. Plantation-based agriculture emerged after the discovery of the Americas. The crops that could be grown in the New World were sought after in Europe, creating the need for plantations to grow crops like tobacco and sugar. An example of this process is the Portuguese and their colony in Brazil. This land was a great growing environment for sugar. As a result, the Portuguese set up mostly independent plantations, as the entire process of cultivating and refining sugar was done on site. At first, the natives were expected to be the workers. However, the diseases that the Europeans brought over killed many of them. One of the worst diseases was smallpox. The Portuguese then turned to Africans to work on the fields. By 1620, most of the plantations were using African laborers. Other crops that were grown in the Caribbean were indigo, tobacco, cotton, cacao, and ginger. Similar to Brazil, the cash crop of sugar ended up being the largest one cultivated. In addition, the North American colonies also developed plantations, especially in the Chesapeake area to start with. In this area, tobacco was one of the main crops grown. Due to the spread of disease, African Americans gradually replaced Native Americans as slave laborers. Plantation colonies in Brazil were the first to undergo this change. The declining population of indentured servants also contributed to the reliance upon Africans for slave labor. Typically, slaves worked on cash crop plantations and also in mines. The Spanish and Portuguese became leading empire builders in Period 1 because of their successful colonization of the Americas. Their conquistadors were responsible for the death of many native tribes, both by force and by transmission of diseases. They also didn't pay much attention to the culture and traditions of the native people. The Spanish justified their conquest by saying they were bearers of civilization. Other European powers like the British, French, and Dutch were following closely behind. Now taking a look at the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Before the Age of Exploration, Europe had a feudal economy and society. That type of economy was very localized, as new lands were discovered and conquered by European empires. European merchants, investors, and planters garnered profits of the transatlantic trade. However, this trade was highly regulated in a mercantilist economy. Nations wanted to decrease imports from foreign countries and increase exports. This made the European monarchs, like those of Spain and England, extremely wealthy, as well as some merchants, investors, and planters. Stretching well past Period 1, as more profitable markets were discovered in the New World, the private economy grew and became more capitalistic. Merchants, planters, and consumers were deciding the selling and buying prices. Okay, on to the racist idea of white superiority. For various reasons, Europeans felt they were superior to Native Americans and Africans. In Period 1, a few of the reasons Europeans felt this way were: most Europeans were Christians, and they felt that that was the one true religion. There were also many differences in culture between the groups, and Europeans thought their cultural ideals were superior. And at this time, Europeans had technological superiority in a few key areas, like military equipment. During Period 1, there was an influx of Europeans to the Americas. With them, they also brought enslaved Africans. This greatly affected the Native Americans, with the Europeans trying to force their beliefs and ideals onto them. The Africans and natives tried desperately to maintain their cultural autonomy, or in other words, they tried to preserve their culture and religion. Along with cultural autonomy, Native Americans attempted to preserve their political autonomy from European rule, especially the Spanish and Portuguese in Period 1. The Mexica, also known as the Aztecs, and Inca, fought against the conquistadors. Disease and technological differences made resisting Spanish colonization and rule near impossible. However, some were successful in resisting Spanish domination, especially those with more nomadic hunter-gatherer ways, like in the American Southwest and Great Plains areas. Finally, the all-important Columbian Exchange. This was the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, diseases, and ideas from the Americas, West Africa, and Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. Some examples include the different peoples from Africa and Europe, along with diseases and livestock like horses that went to the New World. Some examples of things going from the New World to the Old World include important foods like corn and potatoes that allow for greater crop yields and population growth. Hello, APUSHers. Today we're looking at key terms for Period 2. These terms come straight out of the College Board framework for AP US History and are many times in questions and possible responses on AP US History exams. I highly recommend taking notes during the video as that will help with retention. Okay, let's jump into it. First, let's pick up where we left off in Period 1, and that is Spanish colonization. During Period 2, Spain continued to expand their power and control over their colonies in the New World, along with their caste-based racial hierarchical system that dominated the social, political, and economic structure of their colonies. In Period 2, they were now in more direct competition with France and Great Britain in the transatlantic trade. Also, several conflicts broke out between Spain and rising European powers. And by the end of the period, Spain had started a long, slow decline in power and prestige. We're going to take a quick look at French colonization of North America. As you can see on the right in blue and purple, the French claimed large swaths of territory from New Orleans up to eastern Canada. In the more northern reaches of modern-day Canada, the French focused on the fur trade in the Hudson Bay and St. Lawrence areas. It was only lightly populated by the French, who struck treaties and fur trade agreements with native tribes. There was a considerable amount of intermarriage between French traders and settlers, and Native Americans. And the French did have numerous Catholic priests and orders focused on converting the Native Americans, unlike the nearby British colonies. The British began colonization a little later than other European powers. They focused more on trade than conversion of natives to Christianity. Their colonies were also safe havens for various groups, including Puritans and Quakers. The British were also more homogeneous than the Spanish, with very little intermarriage with natives or Africans. The map on the right shows their colonies on the mainland. However, most of their activity in Period 2 was in the Caribbean. In the Spanish colonies, and to a lesser extent the French colonies, there was a great amount of mixing between Spanish, Native Americans, and Africans. For the Spanish colonies, this resulted in a complex racial caste system seen on the right. There were different rules and laws for each caste. Those on top had the most privilege, while those on the bottom had the least. This is contrasted with the British, which stayed much more homogeneous. Indentured servants were a labor force for colonies in the New World. It is different from slavery. Servants were poor or possibly imprisoned Europeans who, in return for their passage to the New World, contracted their labor out for a period of time, typically in the 5 to 7 year range. The servant had very few rights while indentured, but once the contract was completed, they were free. This system was ripe with corruption, as some masters treated their servants horribly and extended a servant's contract if they disobeyed or tried to escape. The transatlantic slave trade occurred roughly from the early 16th century to the mid-19th century. It is hard to know for sure the exact numbers, but historians estimated that the trade transported around 12.5 million enslaved Africans to the New World. Once in the New World, enslaved Africans were forced to perform many types of jobs. Most of them toiled away on cash crop plantations, especially sugar and tobacco early on, and later cotton. Harsh chattel laws were passed in many colonies, making slavery race-based, and those laws typically cut off any path to legal freedom for an enslaved person. Africans also resisted enslavement in two ways, the first being overt resistance, which included running away in rebellions like the Stono or Nat Turner. Later on in periods 4 and 5, we will discuss the whole network of helping escape slaves called the Underground Railroad. Overt was not the only way Africans resisted enslavement, as there were constant acts of covert resistance, which include some examples like working slowly, faking an illness, and stealing food. Moving on to a different topic, Puritans were British Protestants who followed Calvin's teachings and believed in predestination. They felt the Anglican Church did not reform itself enough after the split with Catholicism. At times they were persecuted in England. Some pilgrims set off to completely separate themselves from England. These were the settlers who crossed the Atlantic in the Mayflower and set up the Plymouth colony. Others worked within the colonial framework to establish a colony based in Puritan beliefs. This was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which eventually will engulf the Plymouth colony. When the British settled in North America, they had a much more homogeneous society than the Spanish or French colonies. A homogeneous society means a society that shares the same traits like language and culture. This is in contrast to the Spanish, who had a lot more intermixing in their colonies between Spanish, Africans, and Native Americans. Now on to the middle colonies, which were very diverse compared to the more Puritan New England and cash crop focused Virginia areas. There is a lot I could say about all of these colonies, but let's keep it brief to just the notable information for APUSH. Pennsylvania will be secured as a safe haven for pacifist and nonconformist Quakers, and that colony will focus on wheat production. And New York actually started out as a Dutch colony, with New York City being first called New Amsterdam. After some shenanigans in Europe, the Dutch basically gave New York to the British. The now New York City is known for its good harbor and position on the East Coast that allowed it to grow to a major center of trade. The middle colonies became the early breadbasket of the British colonies. They produced surpluses of wheat and corn, which are referred to as staple crops. These crops helped feed other areas of the colonies that produced less food and more cash crops like Virginia. They were also exported to England. For the Pueblo Revolt, we go back to the Spanish colonies, and specifically Spanish New Mexico, where Native Americans were treated very poorly by the Spanish, including suppressing their traditional beliefs and putting huge demands on native labor. The Pueblo Native Americans rebelled against Spanish officials, priests, and settlers, and for a short period of time had driven them out of the region. However, the Spanish would return, but became more tolerant and accommodating to Native American beliefs and culture. I went into a lot more detail in a separate video specifically about the topic, so check that out. Okay, next important term. The British had a strong viewpoint on property rights and contracts when it applied to dealings between each other. However, in colonizing North America, British settlers pushed against Native American territory, resulting in conflict with Native Americans, and usually Native Americans being pushed off their land. This was in part due to feelings of superiority over Native Americans. In general, Great Britain and Europe had a very patriarchal society. Women, if married, had no claim to property or even children if the marriage was annulled. They believed women had their sphere, which was housework, raising children, subservient to their husband, and being pious and moral center of the family, while the men's sphere was outdoor work, drinking in the tavern with mates, and the leader of the family in business or political matters. So when referring to the Atlantic world, we are talking about the political, cultural, and economic exchanges around the Atlantic Ocean because of the interactions between Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans. This also heavily impacted the development of the colonies in North America and led to economic growth in several European countries, including Spain and England. It also changed labor systems as well as expanded social networks. Finally, the labor market exchange of European and New World goods impacted the Atlantic economy, as shown in the transatlantic slave trade and shipment of products and resources from the Americas to Europe. Okay, on to the Enlightenment, which is a European intellectual movement throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. It focused on rational thought, science, and logic. Some of its most influential philosophers were John Locke, Adam Smith, and Descartes. Their ideas of self-government and natural rights, especially Locke's, will have a great influence on colonial American leaders like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. We will revisit those ideas with the Declaration of Independence and Common Sense in Period 3. Roughly the time period of the First Great Awakening goes from the 1730s to the 1770s. We will mostly focus on the impacts in colonial America, but note that this is also an international movement, as it is also occurring in Europe, which shows an example of transatlantic exchange of ideas. Core to the Great Awakening is the revitalization of religious piety. Some may say it is a counter to the more secular Enlightenment movement popular among educated elites, and at the very least, it runs concurrent to it. Another major facet to the First Great Awakening is the distinction between the old light preachers, who are more likely to be longtime hometown ministers and offer a more conservative or moderate style and content to their sermons, versus the new light preachers, who are a major part of the First Great Awakening. They were more likely to be traveling preachers that attracted huge crowds to their sermons, which were filled with raucous hellfire and brimstone style oration, and many times the crowds would participate with shouts along the lines of, "Save me." Two of the major New Light preachers you will see on the AP test are Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, both of whom spoke of terrifying images of the corruption of human nature and terrors awaiting unbelievers and sinners who did not repent. Also, the First Great Awakening is an excellent example of Protestant evangelism, or the practice of spreading Christianity. In Period 1, we talked a lot about the Roman Catholic Church and its major goals of spreading Christianity. For Protestants, the First Great Awakening is an example for them. And finally, the First Great Awakening and the traveling New Light preachers were particularly popular in the rural backcountry across colonial America. Finally is the economic policy of mercantilism, which was employed by the colonizing European powers that sought to maximize exports and limit imports through a highly regulated trading network. These policies aimed to increase their wealth, usually meaning gold and silver of a nation, so it would increase its power and prestige. Looking specifically at the British, they tried to create a closed system of trade between their colonies and mother country. The Navigation Acts are a great example of this. At the same time, they tried to increase their exports like textiles from their mother country to their colonies and other European powers. Everything going in and out was taxed. Important note, the American colonies were always trying to sidestep this system with ignoring the export rules and taxes. When the British clamped down in Period 3, this will be a major cause of the revolution. Hello, APUSH peeps. Today we're going over Period 3 key terms. This will be a great way to either start Period 3 or review for a summative. So let's go. First, we start with the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, which was a war between Great Britain and France with her Indian allies. In North America, the fighting was over the control of the Ohio River Valley, and which power would have control over what is the eastern half of North America. The British won this war of rising global powers, but they went into great debt to do so. For our North American British colonies, this will lead to a loss of salutary neglect, as the British will become more hands-on with governing and regulating their colonies in order to avoid war with Native Americans and extract resources and taxes. A pre-Revolutionary War development is the rise of colonial elites. These are individuals that, because of expanding trade, led to amassing considerable wealth. Generally, these were rich merchants in Boston and New York, or wealthy plantation owners in the South. These elites increasingly became connected to each other through gatherings like the Stamp Act Congress, Continental Congress, or writing to each other through the Committees of Correspondence. This leads to increased colonial coordination. Loyalists are American colonists who are against antagonizing the British with protest and violence. They will go on to support the British in the Revolutionary War, and while given equal rights in the Treaty of Paris, many will still go back to England. A major loyalist figure is Thomas Hutchinson. On the other end were patriots. Most of them believed the British have unlawfully restricted natural rights and were against the British in the Revolution. There are many major figures, but some of the most prominent were Washington, Paine, Revere, Adams, Henry, and Franklin. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Influenced by many other revolutionary ideas in literature, like Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. In Common Sense, Paine calls for independence and a republican government. He says it is absurd for an island to rule a continent and criticizes the traditional tyrannical monarchy. His pamphlet is widely read around the colonies and written in easy-to-read and understand vernacular. The first battles of the Revolutionary War actually take place in Concord and Lexington a year before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. A British detachment based in the hotspot of revolutionary fervor, Massachusetts, went into the colony to disarm militias. Instead, the militias fought the British. A year later, the colonies formally declared independence. The war itself has many twists and turns, which we're not going to cover here. It ultimately ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and the formation of the United States. The war is a part or result of the overall American Revolution. So let's take a quick look at this. Some will say, notably John Adams, the revolution occurred before the war. He meant that the revolution was the ideas of natural rights and the American colonists identifying themselves less as British subjects and more as free Americans. The Declaration of Independence and war were a result or effect of those ideas. Others say the revolution occurs after the war when the ideas are put into practice, and we can see that with the democratic forms of government in the failed Articles of Confederation and a successful Constitution with its Bill of Rights. And still others say it is ongoing, that the U.S. has struggled to live up to its ideals laid in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. There has been continuous revolution through its history, as seen in the ending of slavery, expanding women's rights and roles, and ending segregation. The Declaration of Independence does more than break away the colonies from Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson, the author, discusses inherent inalienable rights that are not dependent on government, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and also declaring that all men are created equal. This has a strong philosophical basis in the writings of John Locke and the Enlightenment. Okay, next we have the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government. It will be short-lived, though, as it fails due to its lack of an effective centralized government. Some of the issues are there was no power to raise an army, impose taxes, or regulate commerce. It does have one success, though, and that is the Northwest Ordinance, which organizes the Northwest territories gained in the Treaty of Paris. The ordinance outlines requirements for statehood and also bans slavery in the Northwest territories. With the government under the Articles of Confederation not working well, leaders from across the states gathered to draft a new government under a constitution. At the drafting of this government, many issues were debated, including how the legislative branch should be organized, the relation of the national government to state governments, slavery, and the power of the executive branch. After the draft was complete, it was sent to the states for ratification. Let's get into a few details about the Constitution. It sets up three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and a power-sharing structure amongst them. There are also checks and balances. The principal author of the Constitution tried to make sure power was spread out in order to avoid tyranny, but also make a government that can function efficiently. The next major aspect of the Constitution and new government is federalism. So basically, power is shared between state governments and the federal government. Over time, the federal government has grown in power and reach, while state governments have lost power. But we still see aspects of this separation today. For example, education systems and marijuana laws. Now, let's talk about those who supported the Constitution and those who did not. The Federalists were the group that favored the Constitution and a strong central government. They wanted to limit state power and said the Senate would still support state interests. While not directly opposing the Bill of Rights, they also did not feel one was necessary. They definitely wanted to get rid of the weak Articles of Confederation, and their base of support was mostly large-scale farmers, merchants, and artisans. In general, they were also pro-British style of government, with a hierarchical structure and somewhat of a distrust of the people. On the other side were the Anti-Federalists, who opposed the Constitution and a strong central government. They supported state power and rights. Also, they said if a Constitution must be passed, at the very least, it must include a Bill of Rights. They were more open to amending the Articles than creating and passing the Constitution. In general, they want a smaller republic, or as Jefferson would call it, a yeoman farmer republic, of which their base of support was small rural farmers. Later, many of the Anti-Federalists would also be supportive of the French Revolution. So in general, both these groups agree upon having an independent country and a republic. However, they disagree on what direction America should take and the strength and power of the national government. This will lead to nasty divisions later on and ongoing debates throughout all of U.S. history about the size and role of U.S. government. Both of these groups are not political parties. However, they plant the seeds of the first two-party system of the Hamiltonian Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. Moving on to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments were added to the Constitution shortly after its adoption. They are heavily supported by Anti-Federalists. The amendments themselves have many legal protections and civil rights. While the U.S. may have been a republic, it was not very democratic. Voting was limited to only white males with property. Property qualifications will be done away with in the 1800s, but it will be a long, slow process until the right to vote is expanded to all. The French Revolution is a major upheaval within France that will impact all of Europe and much of the world, including the United States. The revolution starts out with similar ideas to the American Revolution of doing away with monarchy and elite privileges and guaranteeing rights for all. However, it takes a turn towards violence, executions, and an overall reign of terror. Within the U.S., there is a heavy and divisive debate about where the U.S. should stand. Some felt strongly pro-French, as they identified with both the ideals of the French Revolution, and the U.S. owed the French for support, as they supported the U.S. Revolution. Others, notably Hamilton, will be anti-French, and regard the revolution and terror as the exact thing the U.S. was trying to prevent with a stronger federal government. The Hamiltonians will regard the British model as more stable. The now President Washington will try to take a middle approach and declare neutrality, and the U.S. would only act to protect its economic interests. Washington's famous farewell address, a staple of many AP U.S. history tests. Washington decides to not seek a third term as president, thereby setting an important precedent. Before he leaves, though, he gives an increasingly divided country words of wisdom in his farewell address, of which all of it will not be followed at some point. He says to stay out of European conflicts, which America will do until the 20th century. Washington warns against forming political parties because that will lead to more division. However, that happens immediately after Washington is gone. Finally, and this goes along with the political parties warning, is to not become divided by regional interests. And we know this will be a major hallmark of the 1800s, with divisions over tariffs and especially slavery. So great advice, but not followed. Speaking of political parties, let's take a look at the first two. Starting with the Hamiltonian Federalists, they favor a strong federal government, a national bank, tariffs to support a manufacturing economy, and good relations with Great Britain, not Green Bay, which does not exist yet. And I don't think Hamilton would have been a Packers fan. Seems more like a Giants fan. I think Jefferson would have more appreciated the Packers. Small town team owned by a group of regular shareholders. Anyways, the Jeffersonian Democrats were founded by their namesake, Jefferson, and buddy James Madison. In general, there is a clear link to the Anti-Federalists here. They favor states' rights, less federal government, oppose the national bank, and are pro-French. There is kind of a key switch here, though, and that is Madison, who authored the Constitution, now joining the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Okay, let's run a few pieces of key info from the 1790s. Try to view these through the lens of the Federalists and Republicans. A lot of College Board questions like to ask how those two camps view these events. So the first one we're going to cover is Jay's Treaty, and how that attempts to resolve lingering issues with the British, including removing the British from the Northwest Territories, ending the impressment of American sailors, and working out some debt issues. The Federalists cheered the treaty, while the Republicans, especially Secretary of State Jefferson, were very critical of it. I want to briefly run through some key events from Adams' tumultuous one-term presidency. First, the XYZ affair, which was a foreign relations debacle. It was made public that American diplomats were to pay a French official a bribe for international relations. Coming after the uproar of the XYZ affair, a quasi or undeclared war with France occurred. This was a result of poor relations between the US and France. The war itself was a short-lived naval war with France. But again, circling back to the Federalists and Republicans, those in the Republican camp were aghast that the Adams administration led America into a conflict with France, who Republicans felt we should be allies with. Then came the Alien Act, which was aimed at restricting activities for non-citizens, specifically French revolutionaries who were stirring up trouble in the US. The act allowed the government to expel foreigners easily and change requirements for citizenship to 14 years residing in the US from 5 years. Finally was the highly controversial Sedition Act, a new law that outlawed any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the President, and made it illegal to conspire to oppose any measure or measures of the government. Federalists agree with most of these measures, while Jeffersonian Republicans vehemently disagree with all of these measures. So now let's look at the Republican response to all of those acts that they did not like, which was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions stated that states had the right to nullify federal laws they deem unconstitutional. This idea of nullification will live a long life and come up again in the 1800s with tariffs and slavery. The Hamiltonians and others would point to the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, thus leaving the resolutions null and void. Okay, last term, and a topic we have not spent enough time on, and that is women's roles. So European and colonial society were very patriarchal, and the US will very much stay a patriarchy, with women having their subordinate sphere and be relegated to the cult of domesticity. However, an idea of Republican motherhood springs up, which somewhat elevates the social status of women. It is the idea that now that the United States is its own country, and it's a republic, with its citizens playing a vital role, women need to teach children, especially their sons, to be good Republican citizens, to be engaged in a new democratic society, in which they have many freedoms and decisions they can make. Aside from the importance of education, it generally does not shift the American mindset of gender equality, in which society was highly unequal for women, who are not afforded many of the rights in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to take a look at and explain the key terms that are in the College Board's framework for Period 4. This would be a great way to start the time period or a great review before an exam. Okay, let's go. First, we're going to start off with participatory democracy. With the passage of the Constitution, which only had one half of one branch that was popularly elected, And also, many state laws even further restricted voting to only white males with property. Period 4 saw those property requirements slowly done away with, expanding suffrage to all white males. Aside from voting, various reform movements during Period 4 that we will discuss later on also show an active citizenry. Finally, a part of Period 4 is also described as the era of the common man due to these democratic developments. We are going to quickly cover two important Supreme Court cases. The first is Marbury v. Madison. This case stemmed from some last-minute or midnight appointments of judges by John Adams before he left office. Those appointments were challenged. The mostly Federalist Supreme Court threw out those appointments, but the key takeaway is that the Supreme Court in its ruling defines its jurisdiction through judicial review, which is its ability to declare executive and congressional acts unconstitutional if they deem them to be, thereby making the acts null and void. The second Supreme Court case that we're going to cover is Maryland v. McCulloch. This case, along with a few other cases in the era, strengthened and affirmed the power of the national government over state governments. In this specific instance, the state of Maryland tried to tax a national bank branch in its state. The Supreme Court said they could not do that, and Congress had the implied powers through the Necessary and Proper Clause to charter a national bank. It was a big win for those that had the viewpoints of the Federalists of the 1790s that wanted a strong centralized government, supreme over the state governments. The Second Great Awakening occurs from the late 1700s to the early 1800s. It is a religious revival movement, of which many became concerned with preparing for the second coming of Christ. There are ideas about human perfectibility in utopian societies within the Second Great Awakening. It is also influenced by the Revolution. We also see women taking leadership roles within the movement, in some cases like that of Anne Lee and the Shakers, even being thought of as Christ-like figures themselves. The influence of the Second Great Awakening will be a cause of some of the reform movements we see in Period 4, including the prison reform movement of focusing on rehabilitation instead of punishment, expansion of public education, the temperance movement, and the abolitionist movement. Shifting now to politics, early in the time period, the Federalist Party lost power and influence and eventually would dissolve. This left the Democratic-Republican Party as the sole major party of the country. After his victory in 1800, Jefferson reversed the course of the Federalists and decreased the size of the federal government, and emphasized his yeoman-farmer republic ideal. A couple of presidents later, and after the War of 1812, President Monroe presided over a short period of time known as the Era of Good Feelings, where political division in America was low and feelings of nationalism were high. However, factions would develop within the Democratic Republicans over various issues, none more so than Clay's American system, with the specific aspects of the national bank and tariffs. In steps the very divisive character of Andrew Jackson. He would lead a faction known as the Jacksonian Democrats, who believed in the spread of political power to the people. They were focused on Western expansion even by aggressive means, and vehemently were against the national bank. Eventually, anti-Jackson politicians will form the Whig Party, which starts the second two-party system. Speaking of the Whigs, as mentioned before, they formed as an opposition party to the Jacksonian Democrats, led by the man behind the American system idea, Henry Clay. They are active from the late 1830s to the early 1850s. They supported tariffs, the national bank, and federal spending on internal improvements. Many were against the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, and were more cautious with Manifest Destiny. Switching to economic developments and terms. Economically, Period 4 is defined by the market revolution. This is a physical and mindset change in how manual labor was conducted. Before, most industry and production was done in individual homes, farms, or on plantations. But because of inventions and innovations that increased in efficiency and lowered transportation costs, we started seeing the rise of impressive factory complexes. The market revolution will help link together regional markets around the U.S. The American system goes in hand with the market revolution. Supported by Henry Clay, a longtime influential politician from Kentucky, the system and Clay had the goal of connecting the country together economically and wanted to see the regions become reliant upon each other, which he felt would modernize the economy and lead to a more united country. Key to his ideas were increases in tariffs to protect American industry from foreign competition, fund internal improvements so the regions could efficiently transport goods to each other, and support a national bank to help fund a sound system of currency and help with major loans to projects. All of these things are controversial, though, and will cause rifts in the Democratic-Republican Party. On one end, the South, led by South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, will have a strong dislike of tariffs, Andrew Jackson and his faction will strongly be anti-national bank. And in general, there are philosophical disagreements over the proper role of the national government in the economy. Getting to some specific market revolution developments, steamships will come onto the scene and make water transport much more efficient as they can sail upstream and against the wind far easier than sailboats. And major canal projects will take place, most notably the engineering marvel, the Erie Canal, which when completed will help link the West to coastal markets. A major process you need to know is these developments will drastically reduce travel and shipping times across the country. Another major development is interchangeable parts. While it may not sound like a big deal today, this innovation will be a big boost to the market revolution as standardized parts for common items like farm equipment and guns are produced, which allows for easy fixes and replacements. It also increases economic efficiency. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because they'll become far more important in periods 5 and 6, but we do start to see the beginnings of the railroads. Railroads are highly expensive endeavors, and at first are only seen around the largest of cities. Like canals, though, they help to increase transportation efficiency. Next is the invention of the telegraph, which is a great communication tool. It allows for near-instant communication across great distances, and will in many cases be built alongside railroads. The primary use of telegraphs are for businesses, government, and for news purposes. Sending messages is very expensive. Eventually, telegraph wires will be laid on the ocean floor and connect the continents. The farming industry will benefit greatly from the mechanical reaper and steel plow. These innovations will help increase crop yields and allow farmers to use land that may not have been possible without the implements. It will especially help farmers in the West that are dealing with soil that has a heavy concentration of clay. Now looking at the factory systems, the most notable example is the textile industry led by the Lowell mills. Machines like the spinning jennies and cotton looms that use power from local rivers will lead to a boom in the textile industry. It also leads to one of Clay's goals, which is that the North will start to rely on Southern cotton to fuel its textile industry. There are also some other key social aspects with this new factory system that you need to understand as well. Many of the workers were young women who actually lived on site in dorms. Women working outside the home was a fairly new development in the US, which led to new ideas about work and family life. However, the work the women did was long, hard, and the pay was low. But the Lowell girls, as they were referred to, did receive some extra opportunities with education and made social connections with each other. Now getting to some specific aspects of Clay's American system. The National Bank was the center of great controversy. The first bank was a creation of Treasury Secretary Hamilton back in the early 1790s to regulate the monetary system. America had started out on shaky ground with its monetary system, and a national bank helped stabilize that. However, it had an end date of its charter. With the Federalists now gone, it was on the Democratic Republicans to decide whether or not to continue to have a national bank. There was fierce debate, as originally a core position of the party was that the bank was unconstitutional. However, it was decided to indeed continue having a national bank, and the second bank in the United States was created with a 20-year charter. During that time, Andrew Jackson rose to power, and he was a fierce critic of the bank, vowing to destroy it. One of his actions as president was pulling U.S. funds from the bank, basically making it defunct. When the charter came up again, it was not renewed. Jackson's actions and the end of the bank would have grave negative consequences for America's monetary system. But we'll cover that another time. The other aspect of Clay's American system are tariffs. A tariff is a tax on foreign goods. It is meant to protect American industry from foreign competition by making foreign countries' products more expensive than similar American-made products. However, European countries responded with their own tariffs, usually aimed at their cheap imports from America, which were Southern cash crops. It is a hot debate throughout Period 4, and many tariffs are tried, changed, thrown out, and tried again. Calhoun, the Southern anti-tariff leader, brings up the idea of state nullification of tariffs, harkening back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. This leads to a standoff with President Jackson, and not really a spoiler, but Jackson wins the standoff after he passes the Force Act through Congress and threatens military action on South Carolina. Continuing on with tariffs, Clay's idea was that the money from the government collected with them would be used to support internal improvements like canals and national roads. It was also a divisive topic because there was debate about the proper role of the federal government. The advocates for more state sovereignty and strict constructivists of the Constitution argued that it was an improper role for the federal government to take on. Some national roads will be built. but many of the internal improvements will fall to the state governments to fund. Now, let's touch upon a few other terms and topics for Period 4. First is the well-known Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the U.S. Napoleonic France was struggling with re-establishing its colonial presence in the Americas and having all sorts of trouble attempting to put down the Haitian Revolution, which, by the way, also sparked fears in southern plantation owners in the U.S., as that revolution was led by slaves. After some diplomacy with the Jefferson administration, France offered the U.S. an incredible deal of the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. There was some discussion of the constitutionality of the deal and what were the borders of the territory, but it was too good for Jefferson to pass up. Keep in mind that no one had actually consulted the people that lived on most of that land, which were various native tribes. After the purchase, Jefferson commissioned the famous Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the territory, make contact with native tribes, and find a passage to the Pacific Ocean. A major controversy in the era, and an event that foreshadowed future problems, was the Missouri Compromise. Missouri had reached the point of being able to apply for statehood. This sparked the first major debate about the balance of free and slave states. There was an attempt to put a hard limit on slavery with the Talmadge Amendment that stated Missouri would not be a slave state, and the children of any slaves that currently lived there would be free. However, that did not pass. In 1820, a compromise was struck in which Maine would enter the Union as a free state, and Missouri would be a slave state, with a line drawn from its southern border west to demarcate future areas of slave and free territories and states. Across the U.S., there was settlement and continued search for arable land, that is, land that you can farm. As new territories were bought or conquered, this land opened up for expansion of a new cash crop, cotton, which was made possible by an invention called the cotton gin. Before, cotton had been difficult to work with, as the seeds needed to be separated from the cotton boil by hand to make use of it. The gin mechanized the separation, so now there was a huge demand to pick the cotton. The area where cotton grows best is in the Deep South. With the acquisition of new lands, cotton plantations started springing up further and further west. Along with the plantations was an expansion of slavery and the slave trade, which also shows the free and forced migration of people across the South. Lastly is a term and topic that could be brought up in any time period, including today. For us in APUSH, it straddles between periods 4 and 5, and that is xenophobia or nativism. In the 1840s and 1850s, there was an increase in migration of Irish and Germans, especially in the North. Irish were escaping the potato famine, and other Europeans, especially Germans, saw political upheaval with revolutions occurring across the continent. They did not receive a warm welcome in the U.S. Many Americans were Protestants, with a general fear and dislike of Catholicism, which some of the Germans and most of the Irish were. There were long-held feelings of prejudice towards the Irish, stemming from earlier British feelings. A whole political party springs up in the 1850s to try and restrict immigration, called the American Party, or Know Nothings. They will see a small amount of political success. However, they, along with the rest of the country, will be swept up into the coming storm of the Civil War. Hey everyone, today we're going to explain the key terms for Period 5 of AP US History. This would be a great way to either start the unit or review before a test. Many of these terms come directly from the College Board framework, so are likely to be vocabulary seen on AP exams. Okay, let's go. The first term we're going to start out with is antebellum. I've seen my students get stumped on this term in the past, when it has appeared on questions. It simply means before the war. And for APUSH, it typically refers to the South in periods 4 and 5, before the Civil War, so before 1861, which is a society largely centered on cash crops, slavery, and large plantations. Next, we have manifest destiny, a term that will have many consequences for the United States and its neighbors. It is a belief that the expansion of the United States throughout the North American continent was both justified and inevitable. This powerful idea will lead to violent conflict like the Mexican-American War and countless wars, battles, and atrocities between the United States military, settlers, and many different Native American tribes, and also land treaties and purchases like the Oregon Treaty and the Gadsden Purchase. Remembering back to Period 4, the Northwest and South had their own goals in terms of tariffs, a national bank, and infrastructure. This led to some political problems, especially around Clay's American system, as South Carolina attempted to nullify federal tariffs, and the topic of slavery began to become divisive, leading to a gag rule to be passed on the subject in the House of Representatives. So in the early part of Period 5, those issues are basically pumped full of steroids, and they turn into political violence. There are plenty of examples of the downward spiral of sectional tensions that I cover in my Causes of the Civil War video, but a couple of brief examples. of the mini-civil war in Kansas called Bleeding Kansas, the physical beating of Northern Senator Charles Sumner by Southern Representative Preston Brooks. This was because of a speech Sumner gave against slavery and Southern society. And one of the greatest Americans to ever live, John Brown, who after participating in the violence in Kansas, went on to plan and execute a raid on the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry. He was trying to start a slave uprising. During and after the Mexican-American War, the population of California boomed because of the gold rush. This allowed it to apply for statehood shortly after becoming a part of the United States. California was a large territory that crossed over the Missouri Compromise line. The politicians in California did not want slavery in their territory. And before you think California was some bastion of progressive abolitionists in 1849, know that they treated local native tribes terribly, with the governor calling for genocidal campaigns against them. It was more that slavery was not a part of that state's culture. The southern part of the state was very lightly populated, and California politicians did not want to break up the territory. So a compromise was worked up in Congress. It also involved other issues, including the territory of Texas. But the two most important things for APUSH is that California entered as a free state, which somewhat violated the Missouri Compromise line. This annoyed the Southerners. However, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was also a part of the compromise, which strengthened the previous fugitive slave law. With this part, abolitionists were appalled, and even Northerners, who are not ardent abolitionists, felt the act was violating Northern states' sovereignty and free soil. Next, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Great Plains were slowly increasing in population, and with the Missouri Compromise line already in question because of California statehood, it would really be on life support after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as that split the Nebraska territory into two and allowed settlers there to decide upon slavery with the notion of popular sovereignty, an idea that was championed by Congressman Stephen Douglas. The idea and act are supported in the South, and however, many in the North are against it, as they fear it will open up all the territories to slavery. The act also leads to the infamous Bleeding Kansas that was discussed before. Dred Scott versus Sanford is arguably the worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. I made a full video about this important case, so check that out. The link is in the video info below. To briefly summarize, Dred Scott was fighting for his freedom in the courts, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, Roger Taney, would write the very controversial 7-2 decision against Dred Scott. He stated that, quote, "The question is simply this: can a black whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen," end quote. The Supreme Court's answer was no, and even took it a step further to include all black people, slave or free. Taney argued that the court has no jurisdiction over Dred Scott because he is not a citizen. Taney then went even further and took a very bold step in striking down the Missouri Compromise, which, depending on how a person interpreted the decision, made it seem like slavery was now open in all the territories, and possibly all the states. The American Party, for us in APUSH, straddles period 4 and 5. The political party taps into xenophobic, or also termed nativist, feelings of some of the American population. In the 1840s and 1850s, there was an increase in migration of Irish and Germans, especially in the North. Irish were escaping the potato famine, and other Europeans, especially Germans, saw a political upheaval with revolutions occurring across the continent. They did not receive a warm welcome in the U.S. Many Americans were Protestant with a general fear and dislike of Catholicism, which some of the Germans and most of the Irish were. There were long-held feelings of prejudice towards the Irish, stemming from earlier British feelings. A whole political party springs up in the 1850s to try and restrict immigration, called the American Party, or Know Nothings. They will see a small amount of political success. However, they, along with the rest of the country, will be swept up into the coming storm of the Civil War. In 1846, there was an attempt to ban slavery in any of the newly acquired territories from Mexico, called the Wilmot Proviso. It failed, but frustrated anti-slavery Whigs, called Conscious Whigs, formed an influential minor party called the Free Soil Party. Their goals were to keep slavery out of the territories and make land available for poor settlers so they did not have to compete with large plantations and wealthy owners. The party lasted from 1848 to 1854, when it merged with the Republican Party and made up an influential faction of that new major party. In the mid-1850s, a major political realignment occurred as the Whigs completely dissolved and the Democrats became a regional party, only strong in the South. Free Soilers and Whigs, along with Northern voters, helped to form a new major party, the Republican Party, first established in the great state of Wisconsin in the town of Ripon, also known for good cookies. It grew rapidly in the mid-1850s and was made up of former Whigs and Free Soilers. Very similar to the Free Soil Party, the Republican Party wanted to limit the expansion of slavery in the territories and also wanted to institute economic reforms. Another major plank of the party was to make available land for cheap or free to the settlers. Eventually, this leads to the Homestead Act of 1862. After the election of 1860, but before Lincoln officially took office, southern states led by South Carolina began to secede, or to put it another way, break away from the United States. Southern politicians and even the outgoing President Buchanan argued it was a state's right to break away from the Union since they voluntarily entered it decades prior. Keep in mind, Buchanan is typically listed as the worst, or at least in the bottom 5 of presidents in history of the United States. Republicans, who now control the legislative and executive branches, disagreed and refused to recognize the secession of southern states. So we're going to go a little deeper with defining the Union and Confederacy than the other topics. This will give us a good idea of the vast differences between the two regions. The Union is all the states in blue on the map. The dark blue are the free states in the Union. This is where slavery is totally banned. The light blue are also called the border states. They officially stay in the Union, although there are definitely Confederate elements and sympathizers. In those states, slavery is still active. Lincoln was very concerned with keeping those states in the Union, and when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which officially as a government policy freed slaves, it did not apply to those light blue border states, only states that are in rebellion, so the Confederacy, of which the Confederacy are all the states in red on the map, and all have slavery. Continue now defining the regions. The North had incredible advantages in manpower and industry. Their total population is 2.5 times that of the South, with free men being 4.5 times that of the South. The North has most of the wealth of the country, and we can see huge advantages in industry and farm goods. Finally, for the Union, we see a far more developed transportation network from railroad mileage to naval tonnage, as the Union has a greater amount of both merchant and naval resources. The South does have some advantages of their own. For one, they don't have to win the war. They just need the Union to quit fighting it. They have a lot of local support, and much of the war will be fought within their territory, giving it the advantage of knowing the terrain. Morale will also be higher in the South, as many, even non-slaveholders, will buy into the notion of seeking independence from, in their view, the tyrannical Lincoln. There is also a greater military tradition of the South, with an experienced officer corps of talented generals, many of them veterans of the Mexican-American War. The South also has a hot commodity, cotton, which they can trade for necessary items from England and France, although the North will make that very difficult, which leads us to the Anaconda Plan, which was Union General Winfield Scott's overarching plan to win the war. Major aspects of the plan include blockading Confederate ports so they cannot trade for necessary items, especially Great Britain and France. Also, to take control of the whole Mississippi River, which would cut the Confederacy in half. The plan was supposed to limit bloodshed, as the goal would be to stop the Confederacy's ability to wage war. However, it would fail in that respect, as bloody battles would rage for 4 years. However, the blockades and control of the Mississippi River would be an important aspect of the Union's victory. Another aspect of the Union victory would be employing the concept of total or hard war. This can be seen in the Union General Sherman's March to the Sea. In 1864, General Sherman with 60,000 soldiers left supply and communication lines with the rest of the Union Army and marched through Georgia, burning crops and destroying the little industry the South had. When he successfully took Atlanta, it proved to be a great boost to Lincoln's re-election bid. Sherman felt that in order to win the war, the economy and morale of the South had to be shattered. And the best way to do that was to show the Confederacy that Union armies can march through any part of their territory unimpeded and do what they like. This was also, in his view, the nature of war. And Sherman dismissed the romantic notion of war of just being two armies battling it out on the field. Total or hard war would bring the destruction to all aspects of the enemy's society, and thus bring about a more swift end to the war. His armies marched through Georgia, and the subsequent march to the Carolinas were highly successful in its aims. Shortly after the Confederacy's surrender and the end of slavery, many parts of the South passed restrictive laws designed to limit freedom for blacks. These codes limited movement and many other activities, and if fully implemented, would look a lot like slavery. They would be short-lived, though, as radical Republicans would pass amendments and civil rights acts that nullified the codes. However, after the end of Reconstruction, many of the Jim Crow laws mirrored the black codes and restricted freedom to blacks across the South. And speaking of those radical Republicans, let's take a quick look at them. So they are a faction of congressmen that, led by Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, were upset with President Andrew Johnson's handling of Reconstruction. They wanted more change and freedoms for blacks. They politically wrestled control over Reconstruction from President Johnson to the Congress, and also passed civil rights acts and the 14th and 15th Amendments. I made a video about those Reconstruction amendments. The link is below to learn more about them. Another major aspect of Reconstruction was the Freedmen's Bureau. The federal agency was created to help former slaves adapt to freedom and reconnect family members lost through the slave trade. They also helped to educate former slaves, assisted them in obtaining property, set up a bank, although that bank will suffer from corruption and eventually be done away with. Overall, though, the Freedmen's Bureau served as a physical arm of the federal government in Reconstruction in the South. An important economic term is the sharecropping system. This develops in the post-Civil War South. Both poor white and black farmers will suffer under this system. However, far more blacks than whites. It works like this. A poor farmer receives or rents land from a wealthy landowner. The poor farmer promises a share of what he produces on his allotment of land. Also, typically, the poor farmer is dependent upon the wealthy landowner for farming materials and other necessities. And usually the poor farmer, aka sharecropper, ends up in so much debt to the wealthy landowner, they never see a way out, and they become tied to the wealthy landowner and his plantation. Finally, we have the Compromise of 1877, otherwise known as the end of Reconstruction. The election of 1876 pitted Republican Rutherford B. Hayes against Samuel Tilden, a Northern Democrat. The election was closely contested with no clear winner. In Congress, a deal was struck in which the Republican Hayes would become president, with the promise of withdrawing federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. After which white Southerners took back control of political power and passed segregationist Jim Crow laws, like the Black Codes before, that limited freedom and rights of blacks. These laws would be in place for many decades and would take the civil rights movement in the 20th century to dismantle. Hey everyone, today we're going to explain the key terms for Period 6 of AP US History. This would be a great way to either start the unit or review before a test. Many of these terms come directly from the College Board framework, so are likely to be vocabulary seen on AP exams. Okay, let's go. First, let's start off with the Homestead Act. While the act occurred in Period 5, it would have major effects in Period 6. It provided an avenue for any citizen to attain a sizable amount of land for nearly free. All the settler needed to do was pay $18 in fees and in some way develop the land over a 5-year period. That means building some sort of dwelling or infrastructure, farming, mining, or cattle ranching on it. This was a huge draw for people struggling in cities in the East, and also for people to immigrate from Europe to America. However, increasing amounts of settlers across the West brought upon conflict with many native tribes. After decades of war and the destruction of many native tribes' main resource, the buffalo, what was left of them were forced onto reservations. Then came about the Dawes Act, which sought to Americanize Indians, and I hope the irony of that is not lost on anyone. Many of the reservations were divided among families in 160-acre segments, similar to the Homestead Act. If a native renounced his tribal loyalties, then they were granted U.S. citizenship. The division of reservations would have a terrible effect, as many Indians would be swindled out of their land by speculators. Another aspect of the act were the boarding schools many native children were sent to, with the goal of to, quote, kill the Indian, but save the man, end quote. The schools attempted to indoctrinate native children into white American culture. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed early in this era. It was a long-held dream of many to connect the country by rail. The federal government subsidized the Central and Union Pacific companies to build the first Transcontinental Railroad. 2 more would also be built over the decades, providing a northern and southern transcontinental routes. These railroads also received highly valuable property around their lines they used to sell and rent to farmers and others. It leads to a railroad economy and immense power in the hands of railroad tycoons. Later in the era, the populist movement will rise in favor of more regulation of the railroads, but we will get to that later. The prevailing economic policy of the government in the time period is called laissez-faire, which means the government takes a hands-off approach to regulating the economy with few or no regulations of companies and few or no taxes. The thought process is that the invisible hand of the market will determine winners and losers. The most efficient and effective companies that produce goods and services that consumers want will make profits and expand, while other companies will go bankrupt. There is also an aspect of social Darwinism to this that we will get back to later as well. Keeping with the economic theme, this era is also known for the rise of industrial capitalism. The late 1800s saw the growth of giant industries utilizing heavy machines. Individual large companies employed tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of workers. This will have all sorts of effects, including the growth of a management class, also the growth of unions that fight for better wages and working conditions. The economies of scale and mass production techniques do lead to a decrease in the cost of certain goods for consumers. It also leads to another defining hallmark of Period 6, which is the incredible amount of influence wealthy industrialists will have over government policy. One way these companies grew so large was vertical integration, in which they expanded by controlling several stages of production that might normally be done by separate companies. As the example in the graph shows, how the meat industry might try to own and control everything from the cattle to the slaughterhouse, transportation, and packaging of the meat. This gave the competitive advantage to companies that could achieve it and would significantly lower their costs and help drive out competitors. Another way companies in this era grew so large was horizontal integration, of which companies bought up competitors to increase their market share and decrease competition. This also led to monopolies in certain industries, most notably Standard Oil. Let's talk briefly about trusts and monopolies. We see these terms used interchangeably in the time period and sources, and they mean nearly the same thing. A trust is a conglomeration of companies with the same owners, usually being the major stockholders of the companies. They make sure the companies they own work together and not compete against each other. So it gives the allure that there are different companies competing, but in reality, they are not. Monopolies are businesses that have total or near control over entire sectors of an economy. We see this most prominently with the steel and oil industries. So many trusts would also be considered monopolies. There was a considerable amount of clamor from the general public for the government to take action against the trust and monopoly and either regulate them or break them up completely. In one of the few examples of the government responding to public pleas in the economic realm, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. Corporations, of course, fought against it. And in this era, the act was somewhat ironically used first against workers instead of large corporations. Government lawyers used it to go after large unions, insinuating unions were responsible for the lack of competition in the labor market. This just shows how much in the pocket government was of corporations during the era. In period 7, the act would actually be used for its intended purpose, as trust-busting presidents Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson will break up large monopolies. It will also be strengthened by the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. One of the most complex topics of the era is the debates over the gold standard. During the Civil War, state and local paper money was phased out with the National Banking Act of 1863. In its place were greenbacks, paper money that was printed by the Treasury and backed by gold. The value of greenbacks fluctuated by the supply of both gold and paper money in circulation. Wealthy industrialists and banks tended to favor this gold standard, as it was seen as stable and not inflationary. However, it came under heavy pressure from other groups that wanted a different monetary system. One group was a minor political party called the Greenback Party, and another was the farmer-backed Populist Party. Both favored either bimetallism, meaning a currency backed by gold and silver, or even the more radical idea of a currency not backed by any metal. Both of these approaches would allow for more inflation, which means money would decrease in value. That would help farmers because their farm goods from livestock to corn would be worth more, and hurt banks as it would mean their loans would decrease in value over time. This was a very serious political and economic debate in the era, culminating as a major issue in the 1896 presidential election. The gold supporters, or bugs, as they were called, would hold out in this time period. However, big changes in the monetary system would happen in periods 7 and 8. Tenant farming, along with its sibling sharecropping, emerged as a major post-Civil War agricultural system in the South and West. Many plantations were broken up into smaller segments that wealthy landowners still controlled. A poor tenant farmer worked a small segment. The tenant would purchase his food and supplies from a country store on credit, sometimes even owned by the plantation owner. Once the crops were harvested by the tenant farmer and sold by the wealthy landowner, a portion of the profit was used to pay off the tenant farmer's debt for the food and supplies. The system is similar to sharecropping and led to many poor farmers being in debt. They were also disproportionately black and stuck in an economic system similar to serfdom. After the conclusion of the Civil War, there was an idea floated that the South can modernize and industrialize like the North. Capitalism and industry can replace the agriculturally dependent economy of the South. Some, like the prominent black leader and former slave Booker T. Washington, advocated for freemen to be the free labor needed in Southern factories, instead of an immigrant-based labor in the North. This is an inspiration for his famous Atlanta Compromise speech, which is an important primary source in APUSH. For more information on it, click on the link in the video notes below. As mentioned earlier, a backlash occurred against the economic and political power of railroads. This is most prominent in the Populist or People's Party. Across the Great Plains, Upper Midwest, and South, Grange and Farmers Alliance movements sprung up in support of local and regional farmers against the railroads. These organizations would converge and form a political party. The Populist Party channeled the frustration of the laissez-faire attitude of the federal government and the cycle of falling prices from farm goods, scarce money, and debt. Some of the goals of this influential third party were tariff reduction, a graduated income tax on the wealthy, public ownership of railroads, which is a radical proposal, popular election of senators, and currency reform, as mentioned earlier in the gold standard slide. Shifting focus to another aspect of the era, there were an increasingly large number of immigrants coming to U.S. shores. More Southern and Eastern Europeans were arriving, and as typical, the response from Americans was either xenophobic, with a demand for quotas that would limit immigration, or a worry about how to assimilate these new groups. In response to pressure on immigrants to Americanize, they both tried to adopt American norms, but also hold on to their heritage at the same time. Political machines are a political party organization headed by a single boss or small autocratic group. They work to win elections and control important political and administrative roles of a city, county, or state. In this era, they had great power and influence in the rapidly growing cities. They were able to effectively garner votes from immigrant groups and in return provide some social services to those groups. While they may have helped enough people in order to win elections, political machines are most known for their rampant corruption. They manipulated elections, had shady practices in which they delved out lucrative government contracts, and how they distributed tax money was always in question. New York's Tammany Hall and the leader Boss Tweed is the best example of this. A term that you might see a lot to describe period 6 is the Gilded Age. More specifically, it represents this period as a time of rapid economic growth, but also a lot of social conflict and political corruption. To be gilded means covered with gold on the outside, but not golden on the inside. Maybe some other material like bronze or copper. This signifies the incredible wealth of a few during the era, but many were living in terrible poverty and conditions in crowded city slums or farmers under incredible debt. A way some justified the incredible economic inequality was social Darwinism, which was taking Darwinian ideas of natural selection in the natural world and applying them to humanity. If a person did that in this era, they concluded that those on top of the human evolutionary ladder were the wealthy industrialists and academics. It gave comfort and justification to those looking to excuse their wealth while millions lived in squalor. The idea would also be applied to global matters and justify American and European imperialism. A work titled White Man's Burden presented the idea that it was their job to civilize the world. It provided a convenient cover for the exploitation of resources in foreign lands. Later in period 7, it would get worse, as the idea leads to the eugenics movement and the sterilization of thousands of women. The social gospel is a movement of a number of artists and critics, including agrarians, utopians, socialists, and advocates who championed an alternative vision for the economy and society, one that combats the cold social Darwinist views. They focused Christian ethics for the problems of U.S. society. So there is always a little bit of confusion over the social gospel and progressive movements, which I will talk about next. Do note, they cross over with each other. Great examples include Jane Addams and her Hull House movement, along with Jacob Riis, and his groundbreaking photographic work in his piece covering life in the slums titled How the Other Half Lives. Two of the main leaders specific to the social gospel movement itself are Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. Hey everyone, today we're going to explain the key terms for period 7. First, we're going to start off with a loaded term, imperialism. Within this term are many subterms that need to be explained. First is the closing of the frontier. By 1890, the Native American Wars were over, and the U.S. government dominated what is today the lower 48 states. An important question was being asked: should America continue its expansion in Latin America and overseas, and take a seat at the table of great powers like Great Britain and France? A widely held racist idea of the time was that of white man's burden, which summed up is the belief that Western European nations and the U.S. had to civilize the world through imperialism. There were also a group of politicians and newspapers that were very nationalistic and pro-imperialism. They were known as Jingos. Keep in mind, though, there were also anti-imperialists, like none other than the famous Mark Twain. This imperialism fever, supported by yellow journalism, ushered the U.S. into the Spanish-American War, in which the U.S. defeated Spain and took over many of her possessions, including the far-off Philippines, of which the U.S. would be engaged in a horrible war against its population that would sour the American public on imperialism. Emerging with the first presidents of the 20th century, there were three influential approaches to foreign policy. The first being Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, the idea that a big and modern navy and overall military can intimidate other nations and put the U.S. in a favorable position. Taft focused on utilizing the economic colossus America had become to sway nations into pro-U.S. positions. And finally, Wilson's administration brought forth moral diplomacy and used that as a reason for entering the U.S. into World War I. It is stated that the U.S. must make the world safe for democracy. All three of those foreign policies. The next couple of topics cross over between periods 6 and 7, so they may sound familiar. Progressives were middle-class reformers, many highly educated, that sought to apply the principles of their profession to solving the problems of society. They had a strong faith in progress and the ability of educated people to overcome societal problems. Brought up earlier as an example of both the social gospel and progressive movements, Jane Addams and the Hull House movement is a definite need to know in APUSH. Beginning in Chicago and then spreading to cities across the country, Hull Houses had the goal of aiding and Americanizing immigrants. They had classes taught of English and American culture and also provided other social services, including meals and children's services. The Sierra Club, still operating today, was founded by John Muir in 1892. Muir and the organization are well known for their efforts to preserve natural spaces. They advocated the setting aside of specific areas to become national parks in which Americans can enjoy for their beauty and recreation. So one thing to make note of is the difference between national parks and national forests, of which there are many and cover vast swaths of the land. National parks are more in line with Muir and the Sierra Club's ideas of preservation. The land is an end in itself and should not be exploited for commercial gain. National forests have two goals. They share the park's goal of being a place for recreational activities, but they are also managed for industry as well. So in a national forest, you might see areas of logging and cattle ranching. Muckrakers are a group that crosses over between social gospel movement and the progressive reformers. Muckrakers were investigative journalists who wrote long-form pieces for magazines and books. They exposed government and corporate corruption. A great example of this was Ida Tarbell's History of Standard Oil. They highlighted terrible living and working conditions, like the already mentioned How the Other Half Lives, and Upton Sinclair's famous work, The Jungle, which I highly recommend. And they worked on civil rights issues, one of the most famous being is Ida B. Wells' Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases. There are a lot more topics for the progressive movements, including all the acts and actions of the progressive presidents, the suffrage movement, new amendments, and the 1912 platforms of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, all of which are important, and the links to those topics are in the video information below. But we're going to keep going, moving through period 7. The Sedition and Espionage Acts of 1917 and 1918, not to be confused with the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798, limited freedoms during World War I. The war was not universally popular, and there was a segment of the population against it, including leading socialist Eugene V. Debs, who would be arrested and sent to prison for protesting it. The act covered a range of activities, but most notable for APUSH is the limiting of free speech. Any opinion that cast the war effort or government in a negative light could and would be prosecuted, which leads us to the important Supreme Court case of Schneck versus U.S. Charles Schneck delivered leaflets that made a statement against the draft. He was arrested and charged with violating the Espionage Act. Schneck took his case all the way to the Supreme Court, saying that the Espionage Act violated his First Amendment right to free speech. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, decided against Schneck. Justice Holmes stated that in wartime, the government has special powers that could limit rights, and that speech that posed a clear and present danger could be limited and prosecuted. The end of World War I brought about the famous Treaty of Versailles. At the meeting in France, the United States was in a strong position to shape the treaty in the post-war world. As an example of Wilson's moral diplomacy, he brought forth his 14 points plan that included radical ideas like freedom of the seas and an end to colonialism, and an international government called the League of Nations. His ideas were influential, albeit not all of them were adopted. The League of Nations, however, was created, but in a historical twist of irony, the country that came up with the idea did not join it, as Wilson was blocked by his own Senate. Led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the argument was made that joining the League of Nations would hurt U.S. sovereignty and its ability to act independently. Also, another point that Wilson could not win over his allies was the punishment of Germany. Instead of leniency, France and Great Britain imposed harsh economic penalties on Germany that would go on to have many negative consequences. Entering now into the 1920s, the election of Warren G. Harding as president meant the end of the progressive era, and as Harding promised a, quote, return to normalcy. However, his administration would end up becoming one of the most scandal-plagued in the history of the country. One of the most significant scandals was Teapot Dome. It involved Harding's Interior Secretary Albert Fall taking bribes from oil companies, and in exchange, he leased out government land. The Bolshevik Communist Revolution in 1917 in Russia shocked the world. Political radicals had been active in the U.S. for decades, typically associated with labor unions. However, during World War I, some had been outspoken against the war, and combined with the shock of what happened in Russia, the U.S. government, led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, began targeting radicals. They detained, imprisoned, and even deported radicals out of the country. Those Palmer raids, as they were called, intensified after a series of bombings by radicals, including one that targeted Palmer's house. At the same time, the US was supporting Russia's White Army that fought against the Bolsheviks. The Communist or Red Scare was a cause of the xenophobia of the 1920s that in part led to the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the National Origins Act of 1924, that severely limited immigration, and the Sacco and Vanzetti case. All of those I go into more detail about in other videos that you can find in the links below. The generation that were in their teens and 20s during World War I, many of whom saw combat, became known as the Lost Generation because of the malaise after the war. Towards the end of the war and immediately after, there was a deep recession, partly because of the rapid decrease in government spending for war materials, and also the Spanish flu was ravaging the nation. Many would come to question the purpose of the war upon reflection. It would influence and in part define some of the works of one of the greatest eras of American literature and art, including figures like Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Works like Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby criticized American decadence and portrayed the death of the American dream. After a decades-long temperance movement dating back to the Second Great Awakening, with famous leaders like Carrie Nation and Wayne Wheeler, who saw their goal fully realized with the passage of the 19th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which formally outlawed the sale of alcohol. While there was always an anti-immigrant aspect to the Prohibition movement, many of their other goals of reducing the harms of alcohol were noble. But, like many other big social programs, unforeseen consequences came as well. Crime rates and criminal activity would soar as big cities were taken over by powerful mafia organizations. And going into the mid to late 20s, the economy bounced back and the 20s roared. Many looked to spend their extra wealth on nightlife and entertainment. Speakeasy clubs popped up all over the cities, where the public enjoyed bootleg liquor and a new style of music called jazz. After the stock market crashed, and in the depths of the Great Depression, the new President Franklin Roosevelt was looking for any tool to help revitalize the economy. Repealing the 18th Amendment with a new amendment, the 21st, brought an end to the era of prohibition of alcohol. During World War I, northern factories needed workers to both fill positions left by young men leaving to fight the war and the work orders for military necessities from the U.S. government. African Americans in the South were stuck in the cycles of debt associated with sharecropping and tenant farming, along with dealing with segregation and a hostile local white population. Many African Americans migrated to the North because they saw an opportunity in those northern cities that were looking for workers. However, the northern cities were not welcoming. The de jure segregation in the South was written into Southern laws, while in the North it still existed in a de facto form, unwritten, but still known. African Americans were segregated into slums, paid less than white workers, and were the first to lose their jobs. There was a shining beacon for the African American community in the North, though. Harlem, a borough of New York, became the center of the African American community and Renaissance that saw the flourishing of African American artists, authors, musicians, and leaders that produced great and influential works on a wide range of topics. In the 1920s, there were major public debates about a variety of cultural issues. First, there was a backlash against modern scientific ideas like that of evolution. This was seen most in the famous Scopes monkey trial, in which a teacher taught a lesson on evolution in a Tennessee public school. I go more in depth about that trial in another video. Check that out below. The 1920s also saw the Ku Klux Klan make a reappearance, and this time not just in the South. It became a powerful political organization across the country and had members of Congress in its organization. The Klan opposed anyone who did not have a WASP background, or white Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. They raged against all minorities and white Catholic immigrants. Religious and cultural fundamentalists also supported prohibition and spoke out against jazz, which they believed was the devil's music. They were also critical of America's increasing consumer culture, believing it was degrading the moral foundations of the country. The modernists basically take the opposite view of the fundamentalists on all those topics. The Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt with the Great Depression. There were many hidden fundamental economic problems that arose in concert with each other. Some of these include overvalued stocks pumped up by margin loans in which traders used to buy stocks on credit. There was also an increase in protectionism across the world, which hindered trade and economic activity. New products like radios and toasters were not flying off the shelves anymore, and inventories rose. For most farmers, the 20s were never roaring, as commodity prices remained low after the end of World War I. By the time of the Great Depression, many were losing their farms to debt. With the declining ability for consumers to pay their loans and suspect operating and lending practices, banks across the country started to fail, and those citizens that were frugal and built up their savings saw all of it lost. The long-term effects of the problems were devastating, and the U.S. would not fully get out of the Depression and high unemployment until World War II. A compounding problem during the Great Depression was an ecological disaster called the Dust Bowl. Farming the Great Plains had always been difficult with a lack of water and lackluster soil, and when several years saw drought conditions, the topsoil dried up and became sand. With few trees or other obstructions, the winds of the plains whipped up great sandstorms that swept across the country. Much of the land was now useless to the plains farmers. Leaflets circulated around that there were abundant crop picking jobs out in California. This drew a great migration out of the plains into the West Coast. Some found work, however, there was not enough of it, and camps sprung up around California of destitute migrant workers. Steinbeck's classic novel, The Grapes of Wrath, does an excellent job of covering the plight of the migrants. In the depths of the Great Depression, a new president was elected on a platform of economic relief, reform, and recovery. Franklin Roosevelt would operate very differently from his predecessor, Hoover, or any other president before him, by pushing through Congress a myriad of government programs that saw the government directly involve itself in many economic areas. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men in various conservation projects. Social Security provided direct welfare to the elderly. The National Industrial Recovery Act pressured companies to sign on to various government policies like reduced hours and increased pay. The government now insured banks with the FDIC, and there were many other programs as well. Along with the programs, FDR gave weekly fireside chats over the radio, explaining what the government was doing, and this lifted the spirits of many Americans. The New Deal did have some positive effects, but it could not fully pull the U.S. out of the Depression, and it would fundamentally change the relationship between the government, economy, and citizens. While the U.S. was focused on the internal problems of the Great Depression, overseas trouble was brewing with the rise of totalitarian regimes. Some were fascist like Italy, Spain, and Germany, and some were communist like the Soviet Union. Both limited the freedom of its citizens and extended considerable control over many aspects of life. They also heavily used propaganda to both support their regimes and make scapegoats out of individuals and groups of people they blamed for the ills of their countries. World War I loomed a heavy shadow over U.S. foreign policy, as many did not remember it favorably. The public, harkening back to George Washington's farewell address, wanted the U.S. to stay out of European conflicts. Some say this leads to the 20s and 30s being an era of isolationism. However, there was some engagement, including the U.S. organizing and leading the Kellogg-Briand Act, in which signers renounced aggressive wars, the Washington Naval Conference meant to reduce armaments of the major powers, and Roosevelt had a good neighbor policy with Latin America, in which the U.S. would attempt to end meddling in Latin American politics and help to forge mutually beneficial relationships. However, FDR wanted to do more to combat the spread of totalitarian regimes, but he was hamstrung by the public and Congress, which passed a series of neutrality acts that limited what FDR could do. He did find ways around the acts to aid Great Britain with the Lend-Lease program. In the late 1930s, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japanese armies were on the move across the globe. Back in the U.S., many wanted to make sure the U.S. did not get involved. They set up the America First Committee, an anti-war organization that ballooned to hundreds of thousands of members. It was headed by possibly the most famous celebrity in America, Charles Lindbergh, the aviator who flew across the Atlantic and was also involved in a famous trial of a man accused of kidnapping and murdering his son. The committee set up rallies and gave speeches across the entire U.S. In their speeches, they insinuated FDR was steering the country towards war, and sometimes the speeches made anti-Semitic claims about Jewish conspiracies. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the America First Committee would quickly fade away. There were many nations involved in World War II, as it was truly a global fight. However, the 7 major powers were Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan on the Axis side, and on the Allies side were the United States, Soviet Union, China, Great Britain, which includes places like Australia and India in its empire. World War II, like its predecessor World War I, but even more so, would be a total war, which meant it involved the entire social, political, and economic might of all nations involved. The entire military and civilian populations were a part of the war effort, and also, war would be waged against them as well. Cities were bombed and destroyed until they were unrecognizable anymore. Infrastructure and civilians were targeted, and everyone knows of the horrific atrocities, including the Holocaust, the rape of Nanjing, and the millions of others that would die in prisoner of war camps. While paling in comparison to the totalitarian regimes, the U.S. did curtail rights and targeted specific groups for special treatment. Japanese American residents and citizens under Executive Order 9066 were relocated to internment camps from their homes. They lost their livelihoods, most of their possessions, and their rights. Korimatsu, a young Japanese man, had originally evaded the roundup of Japanese in California and hid out. Eventually, he was found, but Korimatsu sued for his freedom, saying the executive order went against the Constitution. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court, who decided against Korimatsu and in favor of the order, saying that in wartime, the government could take away rights, relocate, and intern people. Towards the middle and end of World War II, leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and Soviet Union, along with other allies, met at conferences to discuss both the war and what would happen after the war. Here we see the beginnings of the United Nations, which would be a second try at international government, this time with the United States taking the leading role. There were also discussions and plans made about dividing up Germany and holding free and fair elections in liberated countries. However, those elections would end up being far from free and fair, as the US and Soviet Union jockeyed for influence and puppet governments that would support either side. The war and Period 7 would come to an end, and a new atomic age would begin with the dropping of atomic bombs. During the war, the US government began a massive effort to harness the power of the fundamental forces of the universe in the development of an atomic bomb. Scientists were undecided if it could be done, but if so, it would be far more powerful than any conventional weapon. After years of work, it was successfully tested at Los Alamos, New Mexico in July 1945. Germany had already surrendered after being bludgeoned by Allied forces. However, Japan, as an island, would be incredibly difficult to conquer. Preparations were underway for a massive invasion of Japan that would cost the US and Japan dearly in lives lost. However, the atomic bomb offered another solution to end the war. Two were dropped in August of 1945 on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while at the same time the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The Japanese people for the first time ever would hear the voice of their emperor, who they revered as a god. He said that the US had used cruel bombs, and Japan had no other choice but to surrender. The most devastating war in history was over. There was relief, but also grave concern as the nuclear age was ushered in, and atomic weapons would advance to become even far more powerful as hydrogen bombs. The nuclear sword of Damocles would hang over humanity's head, where it remains today, always 15 minutes away from the end. Hey everyone, today we're going to explain the key terms for Period 8 of APUSH. First, we're going to start off with the United Nations. The idea for the international body was agreed upon at the Yalta Conference during World War II. Unlike the previous League of Nations, this one the United States will stick with and even locate the United Nations within its borders in New York. The General Assembly consists of all member nations, and the most important subgroup of the United Nations is the Security Council. In the Security Council are 5 permanent members, which were on the victorious side of World War II. They are the United States, Soviet Union, now today Russia, China, which flipped between the nationalists and the communists, France, and Great Britain. There are 7 other positions on the Security Council as well, which rotate between countries. Containment is the overarching U.S. Cold War policy during the entirety of the Cold War. There are different doctrines and strategies within containment itself. The first implemented Truman Doctrine was to support free peoples from succumbing to communism. This led directly to aid in Turkey and Greece. The Marshall Plan directed American aid towards countries like West Germany and France to help them recover from World War II and keep radical elements within their own societies at bay. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established as a military alliance and mutual defense pact to deter communist Soviet Union aggression. Another part of containment is the domino theory, which comes in as a huge cause of the Vietnam War. It is the idea that if the US allows one small country in a region of the world to fall to communism, neighboring countries will soon follow as well. Finally, the important U.S. government policy paper, NSC 68, provided an overarching Cold War strategy. For more context and information on that document, I have a short video about it in the link below. As Cold War tensions between the United States and Soviet Union increased in the aftermath of World War II, it had a great impact on the home front. There was hysteria that communists had infiltrated American society and government. There was some truth to it, as there were Soviet spies, and they had caused real issues as nuclear secrets from the Manhattan Project were stolen and given to the Soviets, allowing them to develop a nuclear weapon far ahead of U.S. expectations. The House Un-American Activities Committee was active, going all the way back to before World War II. However, it increased its activity during the Second Red Scare. Many Americans who were suspected of being communists were blacklisted and then had trouble finding work. It affected many industries, but Hollywood in particular was in the spotlight. The leading anti-communist crusader was Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, who, side note, is from my hometown. His grave is only a few miles from my house. Well, He had a run of destroying people's careers and lives through public congressional hearings and interviews. He had even started to target military leaders. However, the media and government officials pushed back, which led to McCarthy being censured in the Senate, and he lost all of his influence. Even with McCarthy censured and the hysteria abating, there was always a heightened anti-communist sentiment throughout the Cold War. Of course, you have to keep in mind nuclear annihilation was hanging over everyone's head. Dwight Eisenhower was a popular World War II general who brought to the office of the presidency significant experience and ideas. A part of his foreign policy doctrine was to secure U.S. influence in the Middle East, which had grown to be a strategically important region because of oil. Eisenhower was also very cognizant of the concerns around nuclear weapons and sought to de-escalate tensions with the Soviets, especially with the opening provided after the death of Stalin. But he saw nuclear weapons as also a way to save money by relying on a large arsenal to deter communist aggression, so as to save money on conventional military equipment and personnel. Another idea of his was to reframe nuclear technology as a means towards peace and a betterment of humanity with the promise of nuclear energy. In an earlier speech, some of his ideas can be summed up with this line, quote, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in a final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed." End quote. In his farewell address, Eisenhower warned the nation of the military-industrial complex, which is the continued growth of the government military spending towards private military contractors, creating more and more weapons and always lobbying Congress for more funds. A central theme of the Cold War was the space race between the United States and Soviet Union. The Soviets were successful in launching the first artificial satellite in 1957 called Sputnik. In the US, that had lots of effects, with the US worrying about that they were falling behind the Soviets. And so the government put a lot more money into STEM education, so science, technology, engineering, and math. In 1961, the Soviets again beat the US as they were the first to put a man into space, Yuri Gagarin, seen there on the right. These developments lead President Kennedy to make the bold claim that the United States will be the first person to put a man on the moon, and they will achieve that before the end of the 1960s, and up to today are the only nation to do so. A lot of what we just discussed in the first few key terms lead to this event and term, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba is a large island fairly close to the U.S. coast of Florida. Cuba came under the United States' influence following the Spanish-American War in 1898. And by the time of the late 1950s, the United States supported Cuban dictator Batista. A war broke out in Cuba between Batista and communists led by Fidel Castro, who would be victorious. The United States sought to remove Castro and Cuban communists, and so they supported an invasion by exiled Cubans, known as the Bay of Pigs. However, the United States' supported invasion failed, and Castro became paranoid. He successfully sought support and military aid from the Soviets, who began covertly building nuclear missile sites in Cuba. The United States could not stand for nuclear missiles to be located so close to its territory, with the ability to strike major targets in minutes. The United States threatened to bomb and invade Cuba, which could provoke a nuclear exchange between the Soviets and the United States. Eventually, the U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached an agreement that Soviets would dismantle the missile sites in Cuba, and the U.S. would dismantle their nuclear missile sites in Turkey. Okay, we'll move to more domestic concerns now. Suburbanization occurred over the entirety of Period 8 and was influenced by a couple of developments. First, the Interstate Highway Act. Actually passed with a primary purpose of national defense, it ended up having a huge influence on the developments of suburbs, as people could commute to work over greater distances more efficiently, meaning they could move out of the city for the cleaner country air. Along with the highway projects, the post-World War II automobile industry rebounded and expanded. Another major factor was bringing mass production to the housing industry. William Levitt took assembly line and economies of scale principles and applied them to housing construction, which, aided by FHA loans, allowed many middle-class families the ability to purchase a new home in the suburbs. These suburbs, though, were racially mostly white. Some even had specific rules against minorities. As an example of mass production, the many suburban homes and neighborhoods were physically very uniform, which also went along with the push for conformity in the era and the return of traditional family values, like the cult of domesticity. In post-World War II, 1940s to 1960s, there was a group that rebelled against conformity, and that was the Beats, or Beatniks. They were a group of literary figures based in New York and San Francisco. They rejected everything in mainstream culture, including patriotism, consumerism, technology, conventional family life, and discipline. And they celebrated spontaneity, personal freedom, including drug consumption, and free-willing sex. Some of the famous beats were Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and a couple of their famous works are Ginsberg's Howl and, in my opinion, the overrated novel On the Road by Kerouac. The baby boom refers to the post-World War II birth rate surge that lasted until 1964. It had all sorts of both short-term and long-term effects. One of the most immediate effects that went along with new scientific research was on child rearing itself. Books on parenting became a hot commodity, and the most famous one was written by Dr. Spock, no relation to the Vulcan, who in his childcare book discussed a more permissive approach to parenting that required a mother's full-time involvement instead of the traditional emphasis on strictness and rigid schedules. Consumer goods and media were geared toward the baby boom generation, and along with abundant job and college opportunities, no generation ever had it so good. The Sun Belt refers to the southern half of the United States. Previous time periods had seen a migration to the north for work and factories. However, that process will start to reverse in period 8. Led by the booming population of California, people flocked to the warm climates of the South as the advent of air conditioning made the hot summers tolerable. Aerospace industries also were centered in both Florida and Texas, bringing high-paying and high-tech jobs to the area. And there was also a continuing migration from the southern border as Mexicans supplied labor for much of California's vast and growing agribusiness. The government Bracero program allowed for legal travel back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico for the seasonal work. However, that became threatened and scaled back because of white nativist sentiment against the migrant workers. The nativists organized raids against the Mexican immigrants in an attempt to shut off the cross-border flow of migrants. Okay, I'm just going to very briefly attempt to review the civil rights movement. I'm sure you'll be going much further and more in depth in your own class. But here we go. Going back to World War II, there was a double V campaign that had the idea that if African Americans helped to bring down tyranny abroad, they would also earn a victory against discrimination and segregation at home. Aside from Truman desegregating the military in 1948, the victory at home did not occur. The 1950s and 60s saw a concerted civil rights movement that made gains and had setbacks. An early gain was the famous Brown v. Board Supreme Court ruling that said schools needed to desegregate. However, local and state governments were slow to do so, with Little Rock even shutting down their public schools to avoid it. Another hard-fought victory came with the Montgomery bus boycott, which also inspired many nonviolent protests, including sit-ins at businesses like restaurants and retail stores. Also Freedom Riders on interstate buses, and many marches. Martin Luther King Jr. and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference played an integral role in the push for civil rights. When President Lyndon Johnson succeeded the assassinated President Kennedy, he was able to push through Congress and sign two integral pieces of legislation: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banning many forms of discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which would end poll taxes and impossible to pass literacy tests that had kept African Americans from voting for decades. There are also several other movements in this era as well, including the United Farm Workers. Led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, they sought to empower the mostly Mexican-American migrant farm workers who faced discrimination and exploitative conditions. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was an organization that sought to address the problems American Indians faced in American cities, including poverty and police harassment. They also raised awareness of treaty rights that had been taken away and land that was stolen. AIM organized American Indians' protests of relocation and termination of treaty rights policies, and sought to win greater control over their cultures and communities. A few of their famous demonstrations included the temporary taking over of the Wounded Knee site in Montana, and they occupied Alcatraz Island for 18 months. With the feminist movement, we're going to wrap several key terms into one. First, the National Organization for Women, or NOW, organized in the early 1960s. It was led by famous feminist author Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. The group advocated for women's rights and an end to discrimination. They helped push for several goals and achieved considerable success with the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title IX, and Roe v. Wade. However, their ultimate goal and push was for the Equal Rights Amendment, which failed. The amendment passed Congress, which was no easy feat. However, it fell short of the required 3/4 of state legislatures' approval. Now met pushback from the Stop ERA movement, led by anti-feminist Phyllis Schlafly, who argued the amendment would hurt laws that are meant to protect women, like the exclusion of women from the military draft. The Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, was a leftist political group active on college campuses in the 1960s. They advocated for free speech and more say in governing within their college and society as a whole. They involved themselves in many demonstrations from civil rights to women's rights and anti-war protests. Overall, they criticized the Cold War, nuclear weapons, racial discrimination, and economic inequality. Later in the late 1960s and early 1970s, some of the members of SDS became further radicalized and orchestrated a series of bombings across the United States. President Lyndon Johnson was a deep admirer of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. Johnson felt a final push of New Deal-style progressive government programs could alleviate poverty, of which his Great Society program would declare war on. He passed a series of major pieces of legislation, including health insurance for the poor and elderly in Medicare and Medicaid. He also passed a domestic Peace Corps called AmeriCorps. The Great Society effort also included new cabinet offices and departments in transportation and housing and urban development. Head Start programs were funded to help educate underprivileged children, and a food stamp program to help with necessities for poor families. While the programs are still with us today, and in many cases have been expanded, they have fallen short of their goal of alleviating poverty. There was a hope that the Civil and Voting Rights Act would ease racial tensions and help the country make progress with racial issues. However, that failed to materialize. The civil rights movement became radicalized with groups like the Black Panthers and CORE. Protests turning into riots turned urban cities into war zones. President Johnson appointed a commission to investigate the issues. The commission reported a quote, "Our society is moving towards two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal," end quote. The report did not excuse the rioters, but it put their hopelessness into context and called for a massive expansion of aid to black families. Turning back now to foreign policy issues, the Vietnam War still looms large in the American psyche. One of its roots can be traced back to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Before 1964, the U.S. had a small but growing presence in Vietnam. The country had been split in two, with the U.S. support South Vietnamese against the communist North Vietnamese. Also in the South were many Viet Cong, communist guerrilla groups, causing havoc in that half of the nation. In the Gulf of Tonkin, off the shores of North Vietnam, the U.S. alleged that the North Vietnamese gunboats fired upon U.S. ships. Congress responded with a resolution that gave the president nearly unlimited authority to conduct a war in Vietnam without officially declaring a war. After 7 years of conflict, the Senate would eventually terminate the resolution, and 2 years after that, curtail the president's powers with War Powers Act of 1973, which we'll get back to later. The Vietnam War was controversial and opinion was divided. In 1968, the end of the war was nowhere in sight, and LBJ had enough of it and decided not to run for re-election. Nixon ran on a secret plan for an honorable end to the Vietnam War. 2 years after Nixon took office, the Pentagon Papers were leaked, which detailed the doubts amongst civilian and military officials of a victory in Vietnam. This further helped to erode the public's trust in government. Nixon's plan ended up being a long and ultimately failed process of Vietnamization. This policy saw the U.S. delegate more and more of the ground fighting to the South Vietnamese and to slowly decrease American troop levels. Eventually, the U.S. totally disengages from South Vietnam and signs accords with the communist North. It would not take long for the South to completely fall and Vietnam to be unified under a communist regime. Many people wonder, with the loud dissent over the Vietnam War and all of the rights movements, along with hippies, how the heck did Nixon win the 1968 election? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but Nixon himself posed the idea of the silent majority of Americans who were not out there protesting and being subversive. Nixon asserted that they were patriotic, family-oriented, and conservative Americans. The final foreign policy term that is a need-to-know for Period 8 is the Nixon policy of détente. While Vietnam ended in failure, Nixon actually saw some incredible progress with the rival superpower, the Soviet Union. He focused on easing tension between the two countries and tackling issues that were a common concern, including arms control and trade. Nixon even did what many thought was impossible, and that was to engage with and establish ties with the Communist Chinese. Nixon made a famous trip to China where he met with Chinese leaders Mao Zedong and Chu Enlai. This also helped loosen up the communist bloc of countries, as there was a growing divide and distrust between the Soviets and Chinese. Okay, a few more domestic items to wrap up here. First is environmentalism. The movement began in the 1960s and was concerned with protecting the environment, with action items like conservation, pollution control measures, and public awareness campaigns. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, brought to light the problems with the chemical that was being sprayed all over to kill mosquitoes. The chemical was DDT and was working its way up the food chain and killing the birds. It was banned shortly after. There were other high-profile environmental disasters as well, including Cleveland's polluted Cuyahoga River catching fire, and a neighborhood in Niagara, New York called the Love Canal was shown to be incredibly toxic because of a seepage from a nearby dump. Also, everyone living in cities could visibly see and feel the terrible smog from factories and automobiles, no more so than in Los Angeles. To top it off, a nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island nearly made a chunk of Pennsylvania uninhabitable. Both Republicans and Democrats pushed for solutions. Some of the pieces of legislation include the Superfund, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce the new rules. The heavily industrialized regions of the Northeast and Midwest was once the target of internal and overseas migrants for work in factories. This region went into decline after deindustrialization. Many companies moved to the less unionized southern part of the US, or to foreign countries with cheap labor and few regulations, like Mexico and China. By the 1970s and continuing on to today, these regions are full of abandoned factories and have left behind distressed communities. As mentioned briefly before with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the War Powers Act would be an inverse of that 1964 resolution. It limited the president's ability to deploy U.S. forces without congressional approval. Congress passed this law in 1973 to fight the abuses of the Nixon administration, as it became known military operations had expanded to Cambodia and Laos without approval. This is also in context with Watergate. Watergate refers to the 1972 break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in Washington, D.C., by men working for President Nixon's re-election campaign. Nixon also attempted to cover it up and lied about it. Eventually, the scandal led to President Nixon's resignation early in his second term. In the mid to late 1970s, economic growth had stagnated. A variety of factors played a role in that, along with two separate oil shocks, as Middle Eastern countries protested U.S. support of Israel. At the same time, there was high inflation, which meant that money was rapidly losing its value. It put the government in a difficult position in how to resolve the economic issues, because if the government increased spending to stimulate the economy, that may increase inflation. However, less government spending may further hurt economic growth. We'll have to wait till period 9 to see how this all plays out. To be a little spoilerly, it will take huge tax cuts that will balloon the debt, and the Federal Reserve hiking interest rates astronomically high. Our final term is affirmative action. This term stands for a series of policies established in the 1960s and 1970s by governments, businesses, universities, and other institutions to overcome the effects of past discrimination against specific groups, such as racial and ethnic minorities and women. Some of the measures to ensure equal opportunity include setting goals for the admission, hiring, and promotion of minorities, considering minority status when allocating resources, and encouraging victims of past discrimination to apply for jobs and other resources. Hello everyone, we have made it to period 9. Before jumping into the terms and topics, I want to say the closer that we get to the present, the more difficult it is to identify the most important information. It takes time for the dust of the past to settle, and for historians to make sense of what was an important long-lasting development, or an event that would have long-lasting effects, or Supreme Court cases and pieces of legislation that would go down as landmarks. With that in mind, I did my best to identify the key terms that go along with the concepts from the College Board framework. So let's go. If you remember back to the end of period 8, the economy was experiencing slow growth at the same time of high inflation. Reagan and his Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, attacked the problem with supply-side economics, also called Reaganomics. The first thing Reagan targeted were income tax rates. During World War II, they were extremely high on the wealthy, and they were gradually reduced over time. But Reagan wanted them cut drastically for individuals and businesses. The thinking was that would encourage investment and production on the supply side, and less taxes on individuals would lead to increased demand and consumption. To counter possible inflationary pressures, the Federal Reserve kept high interest rates to prevent inflation. There were also other aspects to Reaganomics as well. A highlighted one was deregulation of industry, and the government took a more hostile stance towards unions. That is shown in Reagan firing all of the federal air traffic controllers who went on strike. The 1980s did see increased economic growth, and stagflation was broken. However, government spending remained high, and with the decrease in tax revenue, that brought about high yearly deficits and big increases in the national debt. Also, much of the gains in economic growth went to the wealthy, and this was the beginning of a marked and continuous increase in income inequality. The 1970s resurgence in religiosity carried on into the 1980s, and religious conservatives became politically active and influential. They fought against feminism, abortion rights, pornography, homosexuality, and promoted, quote, family values, not just in the church, but also in the political arena. Television evangelist preachers like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson gained huge followings, which they turned into influence with the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan, making up the wing of social conservatives. Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, another major aspect of the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations was the fall of the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union also experienced stagnation in their planned economy, and there were increasing underground subversive movements in Eastern European bloc countries and Soviet satellite states. After a series of leadership changes in the late 70s and early 80s, the reformer Mikhail Gorbachev took power and brought about two reforms that were meant to revitalize the Soviet Union. The first was Glasnost, which meant the Soviet Union would allow more freedom of expression, and also Perestroika, which loosened up some state control of the economy. The reforms were popular, but they also led the Soviet public to demand more of them. At the same time, the US was pressuring the Soviets with increased military spending, and the Soviets were struggling to keep up. From the late 1980s to the early 1990s, the Soviet Union broke apart, and Eastern Europe flung off Soviet influence. The Berlin Wall came down, and Germany reunified. For Eastern European nations and former Soviet states, the 1990s and beyond held great opportunity, but also a lot of uncertainty. While the end of the Cold War was a great triumph for the United States, there were also foreign policy blunders, including the Iran-Contra affair. Previously, Iran had an Islamic revolution, deposing the secular Shah and bringing in the reign of the Ayatollahs. During the revolution, the U.S. embassy was sieged, and American hostages were held for over a year. On the other side of the world, the U.S. was ever engaged in Latin American affairs, trying to stamp out any socialist or pro-Soviet Union regimes. In the Central American country of Nicaragua, a democratic election brought in the socialist Sandinistas. The CIA trained and funded a Sandinista opposition group called the Contras. The Congress stepped in and forbade any more help for the Contras, and there were also laws against arming hostile Iran in the Middle East. The Reagan administration, in a strange lateral move, sold weapons to Iran and then tried to use the funds from those weapons sales to support the Contras back in Nicaragua. The scheme surfaced, which led to a big investigation centered around a Colonel Oliver North as the mastermind. Eventually, though, he was actually acquitted. He would go on to a career commenting in Fox News segments and president of the NRA. With the Soviet Union dissolving, the U.S. became the world's sole superpower, capable of punishing countries for hostile aggressions against their neighbors nearly anywhere in the world. The Middle East, with its large oil reserves, was an area of importance and influence for the U.S. The country of Iraq, headed by, at one time, U.S.-supported dictator Saddam Hussein, took aggressive action and invaded its smaller but oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. The United States gathered a large international coalition and bombed Iraqi positions for 40 days, and then followed that up with a storming of Kuwait that quickly dislodged the Iraqi army. However, Saddam was not deposed by the coalition or his own people, and remained in power until the Second Iraq War in 2003. The popular Ronald Reagan served 2 terms as president, and then his vice president, George H.W. Bush, served another term. However, Bush lost his re-election campaign to moderate Arkansas Democrat Bill Clinton. Clinton's first 2 years in office had some blunders, including a failed attempt at healthcare reform. Amongst the Republican ranks, Congressman Newt Gingrich rose to prominence with his Contract with America plan. It helped Republicans sweep into power during the 1994 midterm elections. The plan called for significant tax cuts, reductions in welfare programs, anti-crime initiatives, and cutbacks in federal regulations. While they were not on friendly terms with Democrats, Republicans were able to work with moderate Democrats and Clinton himself to get many of those items addressed and laws passed in Congress. One of those items that would have major effects was the Welfare to Work Initiative, officially named the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. This bipartisan piece of legislation limited welfare assistance to needy families and encouraged states through grants to increase job training. At a time of low unemployment, it was seen as a great positive by many. However, it did have many critics, especially on the left side of the political spectrum. A massively important topic and process throughout this time period is globalization. A combination of several items, including the end of the Cold War, the expansion of the World Trade Organization, along with regional free trade agreements like NAFTA, and new technologies from the internet to the growth of international travel, helped to expand the spread of political, cultural, and economic connections among countries, businesses, and individuals around the world. There were many positives to globalization, especially for some developing countries like China. However, there were downsides as well. Looking specifically at the US, it saw previously American-based multinational corporations move their manufacturing facilities to countries with cheaper labor and less regulations, resulting in a steep loss of well-paying blue-collar jobs. Another hallmark of all of Period 9 were the raging cultural debates. As we saw earlier, the moral majority pushed back against some of the liberal advances of the 1960s and 70s. Liberals also pushed back against the moral majority as well. This is seen in the cultural and increasingly political struggle between traditionalists and secular liberals over hot-button topics like abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, music, of which both rock and hip-hop were targeted for censorship, and fundamentalists were also concerned about the supposed increased secularization of society, declaring that liberals were waging a war on Christmas. The major candidates in the 2000 presidential election were Republican candidate George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas and son of former President George H.W. Bush, and for the Democrats, Al Gore, former senator of Tennessee and then vice president under Bill Clinton. It was an incredibly tight election that came down to whoever won the state of Florida's electoral votes. In that state, the result was in dispute, as the raw vote total had a slight lead for George W. Bush. However, recounts were ordered, and issues arose with the Florida ballot itself, as voters had to poke holes in chads to indicate their vote. Some were partially poked. Anyways, the recount and legal challenges were carried out over a series of weeks and into the month of December. Eventually, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, which decided to end the recount, and that resulted in Bush taking Florida and winning the election. One of President Bush's major initiatives was called No Child Left Behind. Historically, education had been left up to the state governments, albeit with a few federal laws to help and protect certain groups. However, there was growing concern that U.S. students were falling behind their peers in developed countries. The No Child Left Behind legislation required all schools that received federal funding to administer standardized tests with the hope that it would raise educational standards and benchmarks, and that would result in improved results. The test results also played a part in a school's rating or report card, and these report cards varied by individual states. There was also a push to create common educational standards across the country in what became known as Common Core Curriculum. In the wake of the horrific terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, America entered into the War on Terror, which was fought on many fronts, from the cyber world to the battlefield. The USA Patriot Act was passed to aid this fight. The title of the act is an acronym standing for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. The act gave the government new powers to monitor suspected terrorists and their associates, including the ability to access personal information. Over the past 2 decades, the increased powers of surveillance have been criticized by people on both sides of the political spectrum. There are a lot of similarities to other wartime restrictions seen throughout U.S. history. The Great Recession from 2007 to 2009 was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. From 2003 to 2006, there was a housing boom built on subprime loans and stock market speculation, aided by the deregulation of the banking system in the previous decades. As the subprime mortgage market tumbled, major banks and investment firms began folding or were in danger of going under. From there, the crisis spread to other areas of the economy as well. It was looking like a repeat of the Great Depression. In the midst of this was the historic 2008 election, won by America's first black president, Barack Obama. During the last days of the Bush administration and the first months of the Obama administration, the federal government and Federal Reserve took extraordinary actions to keep the economy from completely collapsing. The federal government took over the failing mortgage firms, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and propped up major banks like JP Morgan and American auto companies like General Motors. The Federal Reserve reduced interest rates to zero and put in a program of quantitative easing, which helped to put money back into the economy. The Reserve also took the unprecedented action of buying up bad subprime mortgages and basically hid them from the market. It would be a long, slow recovery from the Great Recession. However, another depression was avoided. The Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare, is arguably the most significant piece of legislation passed during the Obama administration. It was a highly partisan piece of legislation, with every Republican candidate thereafter vowing to overturn it. Initially, President Obama was aiming for some sort of universal healthcare coverage, but the act would fall short of that. It did have popular and unpopular aspects as well. Some of the popular aspects were no longer could insurance companies deny coverage to anyone because of pre-existing conditions, and pre-existing conditions had to be covered. Children can be under their parents' plan until they're 26, and there are subsidies for individuals buying health insurance on their own. Some of the unpopular aspects were the mandate that everyone has to have health insurance, which is now gone, and some businesses are unhappy with the law that required them to provide an employer healthcare plan if their business has over 50 full-time employees. A final landmark Supreme Court case was Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015. Groups of same-sex couples in multiple states sued to challenge the constitutionality of bans on same-sex marriage. They argued that the bans violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. In a close 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court agreed with the same-sex couples and said there was no difference between a same-sex union and opposite-sex union, so same-sex couples should be afforded equal rights. And the final term, which I debated on whether or not I should include it, as I think it is pretty unlikely it will come up on an AP test anytime soon, but I thought it was important to at least give a brief summary of it because of its prevalence, and that is Make America Great Again, or MEGA for short. This was candidate and President Trump's slogan and guide to policymaking. Some of the specific positions and policy points which relate to the term are ending America's reliance on Chinese products and protect and reinvigorate U.S. manufacturing. With this, we saw the return of tariffs, and that halted the previous decade's move towards more free trade. In foreign policy, the term meant an America First approach, which shunned some of the international organizations and agreements like NATO and the Paris Climate Accords. This was to reassert U.S. sovereignty in foreign policy. Candidate and President Trump also focused extensively on curbing immigration. This included immigration bans from certain countries, a more stringent immigration process, and the push for a border wall to stretch across the southern border with Mexico. President Trump also reduced environmental protections and aimed to help stimulate the U.S. fossil fuel industry, including coal, oil, and natural gas. And finally, there is the debate around gun laws. After a series of mass shootings, including at schools, there were calls for more restrictions and controls around firearms. President Trump, Republicans, and the NRA pushed back against those calls. And on the federal level, very little has been done in either direction. Okay, that does